Casual Roundhouse, back in your life for another recap slash preview. I'm Michael Trochet, your oh-so enthusiastic host, and with an odd card in Noche UFC, the Mexican Independence Day UFC card, we have a few things to just recap regarding that event before we jump into the fight night card happening tomorrow, headlined by a lightweight main event between Mateusz Gamrot and Rafael Fiziev. So we're not going to waste any time getting into recapping Noche UFC. Real quick, first two fights of the card. Two debuting fighters with impressive victories. First being Josephine Knuttson, who dominated over the course of 3 rounds. She is going to slowly work her way up. I can already see it. She's a workhorse when it comes to the fight itself, and she is one of those wither away at you style type fighters. Flip side, Charlie Campbell, another debut, came up short against Chris Duncan on the Contender Series in an absolute brawl for as long as it lasted, where he ended up just getting caught with a good shot. Came out impressive against Alex Reyes. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the post-fight interview kind of overshadowed the knockout, but nonetheless, he showed that he belongs at the highest level, which is really all that matters. On to the next fight, Tracy Cortez versus Jasudavicius. In my opinion, this was one of the most impressive performances of the night, just because Cortez kind of displayed a new wrinkle in her game, a new feather to her cap, if you will, with much improved striking. And based off Jasudavicius's previous performance against Miranda Maverick, you would assume that on the feet Jasudavicius would have pressed the action and forced Tracy to brawl, but Tracy kept her distance and was landing very fluid combinations with her hands. And like I said, a win like that displays where you display a new wrinkle to your game, means that you are going to slowly work your way up the rankings as well, which is very intriguing for Cortez, because I was just genuinely impressed, and it was one of the more entertaining fights of the card, admittedly. Next fight, Chairez versus Lacerda, had a premature stoppage, unfortunately, due to just a wrongful call on the behalf of the referee. I believe it was Chris Tognoni. Lacerda's arm went limp, assuming that he was trying to relax to work his way out of the submission, and Tognoni took that as Lacerda being unconscious and called the fight rather than checking Lacerda's arm himself to see if he was actually unconscious or conscious. In a situation like that, it's difficult to really make the call without interfering in the exchange that's going on within the grappling. But the fight's already been rebooked for October, and it resulted in a no contest. So, moving on. Roman Kopylov, a very impressive victory over Josh Fremd. This was a matchup that it seemed as though he was supposed to win, and it was a coming out party type of performance, and I feel like a win like that is going to push him to face guys within the rankings relatively soon, if not in his next fight. Same deal with Godinez, another coming out party type of performance where she scored a very impressive finish. And I said Elise Reed was tough and resilient, and Loopy completely disregarded that and got her out of there. Loopy also found herself in the rankings following the victory. Obviously going to have fights against people who are higher than her in the rankings from now on, so it's on her to make the most of every fight, learn on the job, and keep that win streak going. Kyle Nelson applied the exact same approach that he had against Blake Bilder to Fernando Padilla, which is essentially staying in his face, being persistent, establishing the jab, and just not going anywhere. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. He's now on a 2-fight winning streak. Daniel Zellhuber, similar deal to Godinez and Roman Kopylov, coming out party type of performance. Scored a finish against Christos Giagos, who has fought guys like Sarukian and other guys who have worked their way into the rankings at some point. So I'd imagine Zellhuber will find himself fighting somebody with a number next to their name relatively soon. I also do not want to completely skip over Raul Rosas Jr., who obviously had a massive comeback win, massive bounce back win, and he was humble in defeat. And while still being only 18 and being super green, he came out with a chip on his shoulder against Terrence Mitchell. And it seems like with his approach and his mentality, he's going to be able to learn and grow with every fight. And the sky is honestly the limit for him. A lot of people want to discredit him, but he's still a kid. Give him time. See what happens when, 4 to 5 years go by. Is he going to be in the rankings? Maybe, but I doubt that he's going to be champion within the next 3 to 4 years. I don't find that to be realistic. His ambitions are where they're supposed to be, but you have to respect the sport as a whole. Co-main event was a bit of a chess match between Della, Maddalena, and Kevin Holland. JDM with the win is obviously going to start fighting guys in the top 10, which is exciting because there's a lot of very exciting matchups in the top 10 for him with his style. And with Kevin Holland, he can fight anybody. He's established himself as that type of fighter in the UFC where you can match him up against anyone, and people are going to tune in and watch, and he's going to show up to fight. End of story. I really want to shed a good amount of light on the main event while I'm still talking about this card as a whole, just because that 5th round being scored a 10-8 by one of the judges completely screwed up the decision as a whole. And it's unjust to Valentina because there were moments in that fight where it looked like she was advantageously edging out the decision, whereas Grasso had her moments that seemed like just big moments. They weren't gradual as Valentina's were. I honestly have to go back and watch the fight, but regardless, I think it's not terrible that this happened. Obviously, the 10-8 5th round is terrible. I will never dispute that. But a trilogy with these two women being as competitive as they are, it's intriguing to me and any legitimate fight fan. So with Dana already looking to book a trilogy for them, I'm looking forward to it. I had the pleasure of seeing them fight in person when Alexa won the belt in March, and a trilogy fight seems logical. With that being said, that's the recap of Noche UFC. Now we're going to move on to Gamrot versus Fiziev. Again, with this preview breakdown, I'm going to be as brief as I can because I really just kind of realized I don't want to be sitting here harping, making the same points over and over and over again. And yeah, Rendon versus Vidal. I would favor Vidal just because she's coming off of a finish against a debuting opponent in Rendon, who is coming from Invicta, and Vidal just seems a lot more ferocious in her approach to fighting. And obviously we haven't seen what Rendon brings, but it kind of just feels like one of those like alley-oop matchups where Vidal is meant to win. You never know. The sport is crazy, but I'd favor Vidal. Next fight, Mizuki Inoue versus Hannah Goldy. Inoue has had a long stretch of inactivity just due to injuries and whatnot. And if you look at her past few fights, the only people she's lost to are Virna Jandiroba and Amanda Lemos. Those are very tough fights. Hannah Goldy, on the other hand, is coming off of a loss to Molly McCann, who, I would favor Inoue in this fight. No disrespect to Goldy, but she's one of those fighters who only fights once a year. So with that, I feel like Inoue, after the long layoff, coming back from all the injuries, she will be going into this fight with a bigger chip on her shoulder. So with that being said, I'd favor Mizuki Inoue. Up next, it's an interesting matchup because Jake Collier has been in a lot of drag-out wars and has been on the losing side of them, but that's a lot of valuable experience in comparison to the two fights that Muhammad Usman has had so far, because Collier has proven a lot more to himself and in his losses than Usman has in his wins, you know what I mean? it's just tough to call because Collier presents the willingness to exchange in the pocket, whereas Usman, once he begins to get outstruck, he resorts to grappling. So if that is the case and Collier is unable to neutralize Usman's grappling, I do see Usman coasting to a decision. But I will say, Collier came in on the scales looking a little bit leaner than normal. So maybe he went into this matchup with a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Who knows? Anyways, this is a tough one to really pick on just because I'm sure Collier has a little extra motivation, and as does Usman, who is, in his mind, I'm sure still unproven, and I'm sure he's aware of that, so he wants to go and prove something. So I'm going to favor Jake Collier. Call me crazy, but I'm not sure. We got to see if Muhammad Usman is capable of exchanging in the pocket. Next fight, Jacob Malkoun versus Cody Brundage. Jacob Malkoun is one of those guys where he's won the tougher fights. The fights where it's rugged and just exhausting and there's a pace set that is relentless. Malkoun wins those kinds of fights. He's got good chain wrestling, and I think he can apply that to Brundage and win a decision with that. Who knows? Two guys who primarily try to shoot for takedowns usually end up standing on the feet and exchanging strikes, which is another possibility. But regardless, I will be favoring Jacob Malkoun in this matchup. Next fight, Tim Means versus Andre Fialho. Fialho had an incredibly busy 2022, and at first I thought it was going to benefit his career greatly, but as the year came to an end, it seemed like the overall accumulative damage of 5 fights in 1 year was beginning to show. But on the flip side of that, Tim Means is also coming off of a loss. But the thing is, Tim Means gets in there and forces you to fight. And I'm just curious to see if Fialho has taken the proper recovery in order to enable himself to be as ready as possible come fight night. Because regardless, Tim Means is going to show up, and he's going to show up ready to scrap. Not sure who I'd favor in this matchup either, just because both guys are in a bit of a rough patch. But when it gets really, really dirty, you favor the dirty bird. So I'm going to have to slightly favor Tim Means. Next matchup, Dan Argueta versus Miles Johns. This is an interesting matchup for the simple fact that Miles Johns is incredibly dangerous, but Dan Argueta is a straight-up grinder. And Dan Argueta has had a lot of different fights that have ended in odd fashion. But that is going to lead to him coming into this fight with a chip on his shoulder. And I feel like that's going to benefit him. But like I said, he just has to be wary of the fact that Miles Johns is dangerous. Regardless, I will favor Dan Argueta because I feel like he is chomping at the bit to prove himself to everybody. Next fight, sleeper fight. Charles Jourdain versus Ricardo Ramos. Both guys have essentially grown up in the UFC. They have both been in the organization for quite a few years and have quite a few fights under their belt in the organization. With that being said, the experience that Jourdain has accrued in comparison to Ramos, I think is more favorable. And with that, I think I'm going to favor Charles Jourdain despite Ramos having finishes in his most recent fights. Next fight, Bryan Battle, Carolina Combat's own, taking on AJ Fletcher. I have the pleasure of training at Carolina Combat, and I recognize the amount of work, discipline, and focus that Bryan puts into his career as a fighter. And that might make me a little bit biased, but that's something that I'm directly exposed to. So that's obviously what I'm going to favor. With that being said, AJ Fletcher is dangerous. He presents a lot of threats that the guys at Carolina Combat are game planning for. So I'm going to be favoring Bryan Battle in this fight. Call me biased all you want. It is what it is. Another point I would like to make regarding the Bryan Battle AJ Fletcher matchup, there's just a significant height and reach advantage in favor of Bryan Battle, and that's something that he already knows how to use very well. But as I said earlier, AJ Fletcher is very good at closing the distance. So keep an eye out for this matchup. But favoring battle. Next fight, Marina Rodriguez versus Michelle Waterson Gomez. This is a rematch of a fight that was originally booked as like a last-minute main event replacement at a weight class above where both women usually fight at. And it's kind of a crossroads fight for both because they're both in a bit of a rough patch in their careers. Rodriguez was on the verge of a title shot before getting finished by Lemos, and Waterson Gomez has just been losing close fights, competitive fights, but been on the losing side of the decision. With that being said, I feel like Rodriguez just has more to gain from winning this fight, and I'm not saying that's the reason that I'm favoring her, but at the same time, she won the first time over 5 rounds, so why wouldn't she be able to win a second time? Next, the co-main event, Bryce Mitchell versus Dan Ige. I would favor Dan Ige, and it's for a very stupid reason, but you got to think about the preparation that goes into getting ready for a mixed martial arts fight at the highest level. And Bryce Mitchell has exposed to the public a lot of what's going on in his personal life, which can very easily take you off track from the goal at hand. That is something that Dan Ige, on the flip side, is well aware of and embraces, and he's a workhorse in preparation. So with that being said, I feel like Dan Ige is a lot more well prepared and going into this fight a lot more with the, I don't want to say the right mindset, because obviously Bryce Mitchell showed up. He stated that he's in good health and that he's not going to make any excuses if he loses, but it's hard to put attention towards your fighting career when there's so many other distractions that are apparent. So I will be favoring Dan Ige. In the main event, Rafael Fiziev versus Mateusz Gamrot. This is a very intriguing fight. Both guys are very, very fresh to the lightweight rankings in the UFC, and they have both already tested themselves against top 5 guys and come up short. In the case of Fiziev with Justin Gaethje, and in the case of Gamrot with Beneil Dariush. With that being said, if Fiziev presents the same takedown defense that he presented against RDA, against Gamrot, and neutralizes Gamrot's wrestling threat altogether, I see this fight going in his favor. What I will say, though, is I don't believe Fiziev has gone 5 rounds in the UFC yet. He was well on his way to doing so against Dos Anjos, as I stated earlier, while doing a good job of neutralizing the takedown threat. But Gamrot, he's just relentless. There's a difference in the pace that Dos Anjos and Gamrot fight at, and I'm just curious to see how the fight looks in the later rounds, because I'm not going to count Gamrot out, but I will say Fiziev has been exposed to the more world-class experience in the UFC, despite having less fights. He also has an edge in the striking. He's a lot more fluid. He throws way more fluid combinations without taking himself completely out of position. And he, like I said, he's shown excellent takedown defense. So I'm going to have to favor Rafael Fiziev. Matchups and like who you're going to take on each matchup. And as always, I really appreciate anybody that watches this. It's just a passion at the end of the day. It's not something that I'm doing because I have to do it. It's because I want to do it. So anybody that takes the time to watch my analysis, I understand it's not necessarily based on technical standpoint, but I do watch these guys fight. I watch how they fight, and I compare styles, and I also take external circumstances, because at the end of the day, every person that goes into these fights is human, and we all have lives, and there can be factors that you got to take into consideration. Regardless, I'm looking forward to a great weekend of fights, and I know everybody else is, so Thanks for watching. Be sure to like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.